In the same vein, we must mention Tobias Smollett, who, interestingly enough, translated both Cervantes and Voltaire. This really sums up the romps of Roderick Random and Humphrey Clinker, the latter being very often deemed his masterpiece. We have low life, we have adventure, and amusing philosophy. Also interesting is how much Smollett was fondly remembered later by Victorians, though of course he was deemed unsuitable for young unmarried ladies. Last, I must mention the more delicate, sentimental, and elevated Samuel Richardson. He was a printer by profession. Books were all his life, and he carefully waited until his 50s to publish his own production. Yet he wrote, observed, and prepared a lot. The Duke of Wharton, for instance, was one of his clients for whom he printed a newspaper, but he probably took him as a model for Loveless. He was a gentle and charitable middle-class man, but he even freed some of his apprentices from their engagements without asking for compensation. At last, in 1740, Richardson published Pamela or Virtue Rewarded. This is an epistolary novel by letters, you see. The whole story is rendered by the exchange of letters between the characters. It tells the story of a 15-year-old maidservant named Pamela Andrews. She's harassed by her employer, superior Mr. B, who tries to seduce her. After various unsuccessful attempts, including kidnap and near rape, Mr. B reforms and makes Pamela a sincere proposal of marriage. Pamela joins the upper classes and is rewarded. Richardson's aims were genuinely moral. How to save young innocent women from debauched individuals. This was his aim. And he even constantly asked for his wife's opinion. Was his advice to young women really useful? Was his feminine psychology correct? The answer to the last query is probably yes. The book was a massive success and triggered reactions from both fanatics and, as we saw, critics. Richardson was soon under pressure to write a sequel to Justified Pamela, whom some readers, and that's very revealing, took to be a real-life character. Yet his attempts really fell flat. Success did not come again until the 2 volumes of his second most important book, Clarissa, 1748. Again by letters, with multiple correspondence and points of view, this narrates the downfall of a pure but isolated orphan girl, Clarissa Harlowe, falling in the clutches of an even better villain than Mr. B, the demonic, cynical but fascinating lover, Mr. Loveless, pun intended, possibly, as I said, based on the Duke of Wharton. In the end, touched by her virtue, after her tragic death, the rake, le roué, repents before he dies, you see. The response to the novel was really huge. The longer it ran, the book is indeed very long and rambling, the more readers enjoyed it. Translation offers came from all over Europe, and even Fielding, who had lampooned Pamela and imagined Joseph Andrews to be her brother, acknowledged it as a masterpiece. Just as it had done on the stage, sentiment triumphed. At least every member of polite society thought it should triumph. Even in the visual arts, morality crept in. This is, of course, provided as an illustration. This is Hogarth, probably the greatest artist of the age. This is from the Marriage à la Mode series. Well, you'll read the caption here, and it'll explain it. It will explain it to you. Maybe we could end this exploration of the novel, the birth of the novel, with maybe Richardson. So, I have provided fairly long excerpts from Clarissa, where you have Loveless talking in the first person, of course, with letters to his friend John Belford Esquire. Maybe the first one, 23, letter 23, in which you have an expression of his really cynical view of women, but there is also psychological depth. I have mentioned with Noel Flanders realism in terms of real life, real characters. I said Noel Flanders wrote like a plausible Noel Flanders. Here, with Loveless, we have a plausible Don Juan, Don June. Very interesting. He says to his friends that he was ever a bashful mortal, sort of pudique et timide. But he will elaborate on this and give you a view of his tactics vis-a-vis women. But I was originally a bashful mortal. Indeed, I am bashful still with regard to this lady. Bashful, yet know the sex so well. The sex, of course, is the feminine sex. But that indeed is the reason that I know it so well. For, Jack, I have had abundant cause, when I have looked into myself, by way of comparison with the other sex, to conclude that a bashful man has a good deal of the soul of a woman, and so, like Tiresias, can tell what they think and what they drive at, as well as themselves. Tiresias is a character from Greek mythology who was transformed by the gods into a woman and then transformed back into a man. So he knew the two sexes, the experience, and this is what Loveless is claiming here. He says he knows women because somehow he has something of a woman inside him. The modest ones and I, particularly, are pretty much upon a par. The difference between us is only what they think I act. But the immodest ones outdo the worst of us by a bar's length, both in thinking and acting. You see, he says that somehow women, when they're not modest, they're worse than men. The only difference is that they can only think, whereas he acts. One argument let me plead in proof of my assertion that even we rakes love modesty in a woman, while the modest woman, as they are accounted, that is to say the slyest, love and generally prefer an impudent man. Whence can this be but from a likeness in nature? And this made the poets say that ever woman is a rake in her heart. It concerns them by their action to prove the contrary if they can. You see, very cynical, very nasty view of women as, they're looking for it because most of them, they pretend to be modest, but they're not. And when they are really, really immodest, well, they prefer an impudent man. They're always looking for it. Okay, this might be a cliche, but it might be psychologically acceptable in a way. Some men are indeed like that, and some Don Juans are indeed like that. So you see, psychological realism. The last author to be mentioned for this lecture is Jonathan Swift, a great satirist. Nearly all authors mentioned before were also satirists, in verse as well as in prose, most often for occasional motives. This was in line because the great Latin poet Horace, their model poet, had himself written satires in the perfect days of Emperor Augustus. Yet none is as favoured by international renown as the great Anglo-Irish Jonathan Swift. A cleric all his life, and ending as Dean of St. Patrick's Anglican Cathedral in Dublin, his deadpan humour and inventiveness make him the greatest prose satirist of the language. This is probably because his motives were beyond occasional. He had a real and permanent love-hate relationship with human nature and the surrounding world. He was the prophet of savage indignation, to use the words of the famous Irish poet, 20th century poet W.B. Yeats. Typically, when his English patron for a court career, Sir William Temple, died in 1699, Swift said that all that was good and amiable in mankind had died with Temple. He was probably too sensitive, and he returned to Ireland, which he only left for short stays with friends like Pope or John Gay, all members of the Scribner's Club. It seems everybody had to belong to a club in those days. His last stay in England was in 1727, right before his impossible love, Vanessa Esther Johnson, died in 1728. He himself died shortly afterwards. Swift wrote that every man, as a member of the Commonwealth, ought to be content with the possession of his own opinion in private. But his motives for anger reach far beyond religious intolerance, as in A Tale of a Tub. They include mankind's natural tendencies to prefer madness and violence, prejudice, indifference, and vanity as shortcuts to avoid real efforts of understanding, reasoning, self-criticism, and empathy. This is, of course, exemplified in his best-known fictional satire, Gulliver's Travels, 1726. Far from a children's book, it offers a sardonic mirror to mankind via various deformed alternative worlds, you might call them. Likewise, his Modest Proposal, 1729, might even echo 20th century genocidal horrors. It suggests a final solution to Ireland's troubles and poverty. The Irish poor should sell their children as food for their rich masters. The hyperbole is not the worst, and the unmasking of English ruthlessness is not the worst. It's the sheer readiness of some minds to even envisage such things, the absence of any limits in some human minds, without even the hope in a Leviathan to control such evil instincts. Jonathan Swift delivers the dark side of the age of Pope, where theistic providence seems far less assured than expected. On the surface, with Pope, it seems this whole age is confident in the triumph of reason, reasonableness, good taste. With Swift at the other end, you have an inkling into a whole world of doubt as to this stability. And of course, in the next period, everything will rise to the surface. As usual, I might recommend a few film and TV references. Regarding the rivalry between Whigs and Tories, well, The Favourite, a recent film of 2018, for all the unnecessary gimmicks, is not that bad, actually. More accurate and intellectually challenging is provided by The Draftsman Contract, Peter Greenaway, 1982. You should also investigate the great musician Handel, which I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture. I recommend a lecture about him and the life of London theatres by Professor David Starkey. That's from his series Music and Monarchy. In terms of the novels themselves, well, there have been great film and TV adaptations. There's a very good one of Clarissa. There is the all-time classic Tom Jones film of 1963, directed by Albert Finney. There's another one of Joseph Andrews, 77, a bit over the top, but okay. And there are plenty of adaptations of Moll Flanders. The one I would recommend is listed here. In terms of basic must-reads, again, I'm limiting it to a very, very short list. Alexander Pope, of course, some selected poems or excerpts from, of course, The Rape of the Lock. Noel Flanders, I've been heavily insisting on Noel Flanders. That's probably the most interesting book by Daniel Defoe. Fielding, oh well, Joseph Andrews. Swift, same thing, selected writings from Jonathan Swift. Right, that's it for this Age of Pope.